Good.
Good. All right. Good morning. I'm Steve Mayoras, and I'll be moderating our debate today. Joining us today are Pulis and Joseph Kopsick. Marcus will be representing the Voluntaryism, and Joseph will be representing the Libertarian Socialism. Our debate today is about voluntarism versus Libertarian Socialism, the future of freedom. Each participant will have 5 minutes to give their opening statements. After that, I have a series of questions to ask each participant. You'll have 3 minutes to answer, allowing 1 minute rebuttal or response from the other side. We will have time after for questions from the audience, then each side will have another 5 minutes for closing statements. This is a civil debate, so please do not interrupt while someone is speaking. Let's begin. Before, we had a coin flip to decide that Joe would go first. So, Mr. Kopsick, your opening statement.
My name is Joe Kopsick. I'm 32. I'm sorry. Sure. My name is Joe Kopsick. I'm 32. I'm from Waukegan. I've run for U.S. House of Representatives a few times. I've been in the libertarian movement since I found out about Ron Paul in 2007, and read Lysander Spooner and Gustave de Molinari and others such as Bastiat because of his recommendation after that. Didn't get involved with the Libertarian Party itself until just a few years ago, but I'm active in my county chapter in Lake County, Illinois. And I'm here to tell you guys about Libertarian Socialism and why I think it has a place in the Libertarian Party. One of the problems is that we need to have an outreach strategy to the left, which debatably includes the Democrats and could include socialists, communists, anarchists. Another reason is because we have a fascist entryist problem. Ultranationalists calling themselves libertarians and agreeing with the current administration. We need to make sure it's clear enough to voters that we are different enough from the Republican Party to not just be called pot-smoking Republicans and this and that, but to have our own unique, distinct identity. And also we need to do that while communicating that we have an active care for the poor, even if it's not through welfare programs. I'm here to explain why, if you understand libertarian socialism, it should be about mutual aid and direct action, providing people charity without necessarily going through legal government avenues all the time, because that can create some barriers, such as borders. And that leads me into another area. Borders and property and the meaning of private property and the nature of ownership are other things that libertarian socialists don't necessarily all accept about the libertarian ideology. But we're not here to really bash the libertarian ideology. I'm definitely not. I'm here to kind of reconcile it and hold the non-aggression principle and the idea of voluntary exchange to a little bit higher standards. Now, an exchange in order to be fair and free at the same time, or if you look at it another way, so free that it's also fair, that everyone's totally free and totally fair in the freeness of the market. We would have total ability to compete and total ability to cooperate, and that would all be voluntary. So I'm here to explain why I think, if you're a libertarian and believe that we can privatize everything, that could be to an extent true. Businesses might be able to some extent to regulate themselves, but if you admit that, you have to also admit that cooperative enterprises can regulate themselves. And we need to show voters and show the left that we're not afraid of cooperative ownership, cooperative firms, cooperative styles of property management, and that we can actually if we have a freer market system and get rid of the monopolies and the economic rents, we can have an easier time. The poor can have an easier time affording things by cooperatively pooling their purchasing power with little of it they have. And that's how markets can be free and fair. We just need to hold the markets to higher standards and make it clear, especially to people in our own party who think the markets are free already. We have to make it clear that they are not, because of rent seeking, regulatory capture, and other problems like monopolies, and also too much recognition of private property claims that are especially difficult to enforce, like absentee property and large swaths of land owned by private owners. So we need to have more common ownership of land and more direct negotiation between workers and consumers, so we can have more self-governance by firms itself and less outside central government. Thank you.
My name is Marcus Pulis. I am the press secretary for Adam Kokesh, who is running for the presidential nomination from the Libertarian Party. I'm a voluntarist. That's a sounds like a new term to a lot of people. What I find fun is that I actually agree with a lot of what Joe said. And that may come to a surprise to a lot of people who like to categorize voluntarists as being ANCAP or anarcho-capitalists. Voluntarists believe in very simple terms. We believe that the only way you can organize a society is through voluntary means, ethically. So to be ethical, you shouldn't hurt people, you shouldn't kill people, and you shouldn't steal from them. That's what it means to be ethical. We shouldn't force people to accept anything, except maybe to allow for them to make their own choices. How you achieve that is simple. And that is by localizing government, getting it away from Washington, D.C., getting it away from these huge conglomerates of power. Now, does that make me an anarchist? Absolutely. I welcome the title anarchist. I welcome the title because it is an end that we are working towards. What does an anarchist mean? An anarchist is someone who believes that humanity, by its pure nature, does not have a ruler. Anarchist. Someone who doesn't believe in rulers. It's a very simple term. It's a very simple idea. I prefer voluntarist because it's a much more specific term. Because by saying I'm an anarchist, you're just saying this is the end goal. This is where we are without a state, without government forcing its will on us, without it killing people in war, through murder, or through the taxation and ripping away all of our money without consent. Consent is what voluntarists seek. We seek for the individual to have the means of production. Does that make me a capitalist? No, it doesn't. I don't have a lot of money. That's what a capitalist is. I believe in the free market. I believe that when we come together into local communities voluntarily, we can expand society in peaceful terms instead of using force, violence, and coercion. I'm not here to convince anybody of anything other than two things. One, you own yourself. You are in charge of who you are. And number two, you want to be involved in that evolution towards that society. Thank you very much.
Mr. Pulis, if you say standing, since Joe had the first opening statement, you'll have the first question.
Awesome.
Mr. Pulis, please describe the economic system you feel is best for a successful society.
That's actually a really easy term, and I kind of covered it in the opening statement. A free market is what Joe and I both want. We don't want, that's what makes him a libertarian socialist and not just a regular old run-of-the-mill socialist. We want free markets. So how do you get there? Because right now, government controls through tariffs, through taxation, through monetary controls, everything that we have. We don't have a free market, nor have we ever. So how do we get there? How do we get to a free market? The answer is by localizing government, by taking it down to the community, by taking the power structure away from large major corporations that they garner by paying off government. They do it all the time. So what do I advocate for? Taking government out of the equation. The first step of doing that is by taking the federal government out of the equation. By dissolving the federal government and moving power towards the states. Yeah, I have already said myself that if that is achieved, if we reach a state where the federal government is dissolved, I will take action in Indiana to do the same thing here and dissolve it back to the county level where it can be voluntary.
Mr. Kopsick, 1 minute.
To rebut to his comment about the account system. Well, there's nothing in there that I really reject. I definitely agree with decentralization and localism and county autonomy, community autonomy within counties, county home rule, things like that. Also triple federalism, where you have balanced power between the federal government, state, and local. There's all kinds of arrangements we could have with just easy, simple tweaks to the Constitution. But as far as I support stateless market society, but we also have to look into market society proposals that have left-wing goals, such as achieving high amounts of cooperative ownership.
It remains standing. The next question is yours. How would you define private property? And is there anything you would consider exempt from the slogan "privatize everything" or everything? Excuse me.
I would define private property not just in the general sense of personal possessions or anything and everything that you can possess or own by yourself. I define private property in a very specific way, the way the anarchists described it 150 years ago. It's private property in the means of production, which means workplaces, farms, factories, and anything that people leverage and try to get other people to rent and borrow in order to extract surplus value from them. And I think that wouldn't happen, and we wouldn't have as much private property claims that are enforced if it weren't for either the state's violence, recognizing the property titles to those properties, or without the state's violence enforcing those claims, you'd have to have 100% voluntary agreement that each person owns what they claim they own, and that would be the recipe for a free society. But we can't achieve that through enforcement, because enforcement, by definition, requires force. But in terms of what shouldn't be privatized, I think things like the human body, nature, land, air, and water, you could argue, things that are natural monopolies. That's not to say that no single person should be allowed to own them. It's just that there needs to be a mix of individual ownership of what people need to survive, like the land, air, and water. You need to work the earth. People should, of course, be able to grow and build what they want on their own properties and not pay anyone else rent or taxes in order to keep what they grow on their own properties. We need to have a balance of cooperative ownership over nature and individual ownership of nature. And we need to understand what John Locke said, that the entire planet was a gift from nature. And also Rousseau said that the first person to fence off a piece of land and claim it was his private property, someone should have looked at him and said that that's ridiculous. The fact that we live until 80 means it's difficult to permanently own a piece of land. We didn't create land. Why should we be able to own it? You definitely, your right to own whatever you produce is completely unquestioned by me, and I think most anarchists. But if you claim to own something that you didn't create, like vast swaths of land that other people need to survive, or nature itself, that's ridiculous. And if you destroy nature, the community needs to have a way to hold you accountable, and that's where economic systems like Georgism and the way it manages land comes in. And that's why geo-libertarianism is a critique of the libertarians' difficulty getting an environmental policy. Thanks.
Mr. Pulis, 1 minute.
Sure. You mentioned Locke. Locke defined how you get at property very simply. He said that by laboring, you create property. This question of who's going to control and what's going to control and all of that is an argument of who's going to force you to not be holding whatever it is you worked on. It's a very simple answer. When you mix your labor with resources, that's your property. It's very simple. Doesn't have to be a big, complicated government involved.
Next question is yours, Mr. Pulis. Many believe violence is systemic. How would your ideal version of society lead toward a safer community?
Absolutely. Violence is systemic. It's a good word because we are taught violence from a young age. And we're taught that violence by television. We're taught that violence by video games. Right? Wrong. We're taught that by government constantly. We're taught, do what I tell you to, or I will punish you. We're taught that if you go to school and you answer wrong, that you need chastised. Now, they decide what's right and what's wrong, and they use violence to do it. Now, you take that farther out of education, and you put it in direct societal use. What do you wind up with? A police force that enforces enforces any rule. Whether that's how you cross the street or how you drive your car at the barrel of a gun. You do what I tell you to, or I will shoot you. That is wrong. It is unethical, and it is one of the reasons why government constantly teaches our children and our adults that violence is the answer. We glorify violence on the television every day, not in movies about, killing this person or that person, but we glorify it by propping up wars in the news every day. We glorify it by saying it is a good thing that we stopped these evil, bad people by shooting them in the head. That's wrong. It's unethical. War is murder. Just because you get a group of people together, give them a landmass to control, does not mean that they have the right to do it. It doesn't change the fact that they are acting unethically. They are acting in a way that kills human beings. So we are taught violence from every realm, all around us. How do we solve an issue? By forcing somebody to do it. How did Donald Trump help our economy? He forced the Chinese, which forced American governments, through tariffs. Everything is violence. Everything that government does, everything in our society that is pushed forward is a violent monopoly. And I will stand against it until my dying breath.
Kopsick, 1 minute.
I agree with that. The state is intrinsically violent, and by its own very definition, which Barack Obama agreed with in an interview, I think around 2008, he said and this is what Max Weber, the German sociologist, this is how he defined the state: an entity capable of wielding a monopoly over the legitimate violence which is wielded in a given territory. So my proposals, there's a style of anarchy called Panarchy, which is just anyone who wants to govern, people have full rights to govern themselves, and you can choose anyone to protect you, defend you, resolve your disputes. That's Panarchy. But it really involves getting rid of the state because it hits at the three main aspects and structures of the state: violence, the legitimization and legalization of violence. The state's allowed to commit crimes, and it can arrest you for committing the same crimes. And also territoriality. So we need to have a free movement and more localization of government to get rid of the problem of central government. And we need to get rid of organized violence and political violence.
If you could stay up to this, Mr. Kopsick, next question. Okay. Mr. Kopsick, what is your definition of self-ownership? And do you consider it a positive or negative for society today?
I define self-ownership the way other libertarians define it, the right to own oneself, but I don't exactly subscribe to the rhetoric and wording around that idea. I think there are all kinds of ideas that express the same kind of individual liberty, bodily autonomy, physical integrity, self-control, self-reliance, self-responsibility. All those things summarize the ideas that are contained within the way people talk about and pitch self-ownership. And I'm concerned about the overuse of the word ownership when applied to the human body, because I think, directly or indirectly, maybe subconsciously, maybe directly, it could lead people to think that the body is just a mere piece of property whose labor and time is just to be, used by markets, to be bid on. And I don't want the human body treated like property, and I don't want to see libertarian debates devolve into ridiculous things like voluntary slave contracts. You can maybe debate how long someone can sell their labor to another person. Several decades. 50 years is definitely stretching it. Lifelong is just unconscionable. But we have to get to the point of the matter. It's not about just how am I going to be a good employee forever. It's how am I going to be independent, and how are workers going to interact with each other on direct basis. So I think we need to see more ownership in society, but primarily I want to see more families owning the places where they live, especially families who are in apartments, so that their lives aren't dependent on landlords. I want to see workers have more ownership of the companies that they work at, but more violently enforcing the existing set of private property claims, which are already enforced and which are heavily influenced by the set of government contracts we have for large companies, and wealthy politicians own vast swaths of land. So do the government, and we need to recognize that those are obstructions in the free market, and that they prevent people from becoming owners of their own homes and their own companies.
Mr. Pulis.
Self-ownership is the key tenet of voluntarism. And what is meant by self-ownership is simple. I am in control of what I do. Someone else does not have that right. If we do not own ourselves, who does? Who owns us if we don't own ourselves? That makes us a slave. If you are not owning yourself, you are being owned. And that begs the question, who are you owned by? I own myself, and my time has run out. I could go on forever.
If you could please return to the standing next question.
I got to get into this habit of staying up after.
From your viewpoint, what is the largest threat in the world today, and how would you address it through voluntarism?
Well, this is addressed directly by voluntarism. The biggest threat to the world today is the territorial monopoly of force and violence, the state. It isn't somebody in China that is threatening my life, my children's lives, or those sorts of things. What is threatening my life, my wealth, my happiness, is the point of a gun by somebody. That could be the government of China. That could be the government of Iran. That could be the government of Russia, of France, or the government of the United States. Every single day, I am threatened by police who could pull me over in a moment for nothing. I got pulled over here in Indiana for driving the speed limit. You heard that right. I was driving the speed limit. And I asked him, what speed should I have been driving? Because I asked him if he could have pulled me over if I were going faster. And he had no answer. He just had decided to pull me over and arbitrarily accuse me of something, which I stood up to him, and he, of course, went about his business because he had no leg to stand on. But government does that all the time. Imagine the wealth that every corporation and every individual, and corporation's the wrong word, every company, every business would have if government wasn't coming in and pulling their wealth from them. We talk about less taxation. I'm talking about no taxation. I'm talking about taxation as theft. So the biggest attacks on the American people, on the worldwide people, are people who, at the point of the gun, steal from you, hurt you, conscript your children, throw them into wars, and you have no choice but to either capitulate or fight. I guess I choose to fight. But I do it in such a way that I do it peacefully. I simply tell them no. I will not participate. I will not be subjected. I own myself.
Mr. Kopsick, 1 minute.
The most dangerous threat to people in the world and to Americans is their own government. In the 20th century, governments killed 200 million of their own people who they were arguably, I hope, charged with protecting, defending the lives of. And 55 million of those people were in countries where the citizens had been legally disarmed before they were mostly shot to death by the government, or giving just the police and the military have guns. Great idea. So yeah, the U.S. Army is a large threat. So is the $23 trillion of debt, which we've stolen from generations that haven't even been born yet. That's immoral. But as I was saying earlier, state violence and organized violence, which includes mobs, violent mobs, the mafia, terrorist organizations. But I don't want to dwell too much on terrorist organizations because the tracking of everyone's purchases and their social security number and the driver's licenses, making people pay out of pocket for their own driver's licenses. People are just consenting to be monitored at all times and numbered and tracked. It's just not, it doesn't make sense. It's not a free society. That's the number one threat.
Thank you. Stay standing, please. Mr. Kopsick, there have been ongoing partisan debates regarding the U.S. economy. What is your stance on the topic? What type of economy would you want to see in our ideal society? And how could America take steps to get there?
I think the top issue when discussing the economy and the top issue that's lied about is the unemployment rate. We're told we have, I don't know what it is now, 4 or 5% unemployment rate. We have to remember in 2015 when Donald Trump was running, and also in 2012 when Mitt Romney was running, they were talking about how the real unemployment rate was somewhere up in the 40s. Donald Trump said it was 41.2%, and that was true. There are 6 different ways of measuring unemployment, U1 through U6, and they typically are either referring to U3 or U6. So unemployment is a lot higher than people are saying it is. Donald Trump is trying to get credit for reducing it much more than he has. And also the set of companies that exist, people have been pressured and coerced legally into choosing to work for them because of the rigged economy that we have right now. So the fact that there are more jobs, there are other factors I haven't even mentioned, but it's not necessarily a good thing if there are more jobs. And also less unemployment just means less unemployment claims. Non-employment is a separate issue. But in terms of what economy I'd like to see, we would have a free market in economic systems if the state ceased to exist, because the state would no longer have any power to enforce any economic system or make us choose any economic system. So we would have things like agorism, radical stateless market society with total freedom of competition. Anyone can enter the market to compete against whatever monopolist they want to try to put out of business. That would be a completely free society, no patents. And also we need to have a society of voluntary exchange, but also mutually beneficial. Anyone who's affected by the transaction needs to know that it is happening and they cannot be hurt by it, because that is called an externality. And externalities and entry and exit fees are not part of working free market systems. And we have all of these things, and they're increasing costs of everything. We need to get rid of them so we let the free markets function and have lower prices for everyone.
Mr. Pulis, 1 minute.
So Joseph talked about free markets, and that it really is the answer. The target I would use would not be, although you can make whatever arguments you would like to towards unemployment, that doesn't matter. There wouldn't be as much unemployment if we would get rid of the Federal Reserve System, which cripples and manipulates our every single move financially. It not only encourages warfare across the seas, it also encourages taxation within the country. And by eliminating the Federal Reserve and, frankly, the federal government, we would no longer have those kinds of economic controls on the growth of a free market.
And Mr. Pulis, question for you.
I learned this time. It started to go.
Libertarians or libertarian-leaning persons often vary significantly on issues which typically can lead to infighting within a political party. How do you propose uniting the party to deliver a singular message to the country?
I think Adam Kokesh is doing that right now. Localization is the cure for polarization. Right now on the street, you have to see whoever you meet as a potential enemy. You're on the left, you're on the right, you're Libertarian Socialist. Joe's not my enemy, Joe's my friend. In fact, Joe is my ally because I want to move towards a free society, and he does too. So how we do that is by, again, localizing government, getting it out of the way, bringing it down to the individual. Let individuals make choices in their own lives. We can do that. It is possible. I realize that my answer a lot is get government out of the way. But that is the answer to a lot of these questions. Get government out of the way. And how you do that is by putting the power back in the hands of the people. And how do you put that back in? By giving it to communities. Who is better at running what happens in a community? That community or somebody you've never met in Washington, D.C. or even Indianapolis? Or in your case, Springfield?
Waukegan.
Huh?
Oh, sorry, yeah, the capital.
Yeah, capital is Springfield, right? So, is that where we want control? People we've never met? If you want to cure or help someone who is sick, I've seen a community come together. I've seen them do it. I have watched my community come together and take care of a family that is struggling in a time of Christmas or a time of need, a fire. Federal government doesn't even hear about it by the time they need their help. They also make more common sense decisions. So the answer is, bring us together. Find ideas that unite us. Freedom, individual liberty brings us together. They are constantly, whether you're talking the media, you're talking government, or whoever, corporations, whoever, trying to divide us, put us into little groups. It's the women versus the men. It's the black folks versus the white folks. We're people. We're individuals. And it's about time we started acting like it and took back our lives.
And Mr. Kopsick, 1 minute.
I agree that decentralization and localism, as I said before, has to be part of our outreach strategy to the left, and also basically one and the same, our message to unifying American voters, and not just trying to get Democrats and Republicans on board because they are already committed for the most part, but getting those unaffiliated voters and first-time voters, sending a message that, like Marcus said, that you in your communities, you in your workplace, can manage your affairs better than the central government can. The central government is basically foreign to the states as far as some old treaties, early treaties in the United States are concerned. And we need to make it clear that there are such things as libertarian Democrats, libertarian socialists, among them Mike Gravel, John F. Kennedy, Russ Feingold. So there's plenty of common ground. We need to forge that progressive libertarian alliance that the neoliberals and neoconservatives were so worried about 10 years ago.
And Mr. Kopsick, question for you. Libertarian Socialists advocate for fully voluntary association and a decentralization or dissolution of what they view as authoritarian institutions. How would you propose the issue of state-provided legal services, such as prisons or the justice system, be addressed in the absence of these typically state-run institutions?
So I think courts and jails would probably continue to exist if the state were abolished. I think people would, it would be a lot more popular to keep courts around, but libertarian socialists like myself would be arguing that prisons and jails do not belong in a free society, especially not the death penalty. So we would be saying things like we need to have, mental institutions or, places where inmates can be in nature and also learn something about tilling the land and, not have an excuse to run off. It wouldn't have to be maximum security prison if people can be out in nature and there's a little bit of reward in the punishment. So I think courts have been around for I don't know how many thousands of years. Courts wouldn't go away if the state were abolished. I think we can solve the problem of there's a concern. One of my concerns that for-profit prisons could risk making enforcing too many contracts or, laws, which would excuse the mass arrests of people in order to keep those prisons full. And I think having some kind of nonprofit or non-for-profit or cooperative prison plan would help ease the transition to a less violent way of dealing with criminals. And also, we need to read people like David D. Friedman, who studies on Iceland, Robert P. Murphy's book, Chaos Theory, and Roderick Long. Roderick Long said something really important about how we could have those dispute resolution organizations without the state. Any independent arbiter who has no vested interest in resolving the dispute, there's no vested interest in the outcome, any person can be an arbitrator or a dispute resolution organization. Anyone can become or start a contract enforcement organization. Of course, they should be trained in non-forceful, non-lethal forms of making sure people abide by their contracts, and there wouldn't be legislation, there would be less legislation and more contracts. So we need to have common law courts, private arbitration, and private contracts to replace most of the legislation that we see now, as well as those non-for-profit jails that don't resort to violence, unless they absolutely need to.
Mr. Pulis, 1 minute.
You're speaking my jam. Right now, bringing it down to the local level and letting them make the decisions of how that works is the best way forward when you're talking about legal issues. Murray Rothbard covered this in Ethics of Liberty. Having a legal system of, based in a community where you hire whoever it is that you're going to have in charge of your legal system. When we don't have a monopoly of force controlling the police, the courts, and the lawyers who represent you, and instead we have hired our own representatives, we'll see a whole lot less of that.
And a question for you, Mr. Pulis. Foreign policy has been a growing concern under our current administration. What would be your approach to diplomacy and foreign relations?
I like what Ron Paul said, just bring them home. We marched them right in, march them right back home. Foreign policy shouldn't be an issue. Sure, we're going to have to deal with other countries as they catch on that the way forward is freedom. As we evolve and move forward, yes, they're going to need to do that. If we are right now, we have troops stationed, I believe the number is 150 countries and 900 bases. Let's bring that home, put it around, hand it out to the different states, let them have it. Good luck! I hope you enjoy attacking, because all that, just remember, we spend currently more money than, because we're number one, than the next 10 in line on defense, which is actually offense. We bring them home, that money stays here, and so does the weapons. So we dismantle every bit of our offensive weaponry, we liquidate it, and we defend ourselves. If they want to get scrappy, a militia defense is the best defense for protecting a people. Our founding fathers knew that. They described that. Jefferson went into detail. I personally find a lot of inspiration from Red Cloud, who fought a 2-year war against the United States and won. People don't know about it. It happened in the late 1800s, shortly after the Civil War. He won. The United States government and its military unconditionally surrendered to Red Cloud. How did he do it? By waging a militia defense war. Lining people up in fancy uniforms and standing out saying, "Here I am," that doesn't work very good. It makes you die. It makes your soldiers die. It makes this big behemoth fall apart at the hands of a small band of ragtag people, whether in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, you name it. Little bitty cells are popping up. What if this whole country was composed of a militia defense, ready to defend their homes? That's the kind of defense we need.
And Mr. Kopsick, 1 minute.
I agree with all that. We need to dismantle those 900 military bases and bring them all home, especially the one that's causing a lot of trouble in southeast Turkey, which is, has been the launching base for all our attacks on Syria and everything. So there's really no excuse to have troops or anything farther out than 50 to 100 miles from our shore. And we need to have a non-interventionist policy, scale that way back, decrease Pentagon spending by at least half, if not, why not completely? The states can handle it. The states can create a subservient federal government to replace the old one if they want to. It has to be below the states and the people, though, to really be under our control. Another thing we have to worry about, whether it's Western countries trying to protect their capital or communist-ish countries trying to protect the value of their laborers' work, we need to worry about protectionism. And I would go to zero tariffs and sales taxes immediately to avoid politicizing trade. Because if you have tariffs and sales taxes, you can't do business in someone's country or buy their goods without making a political decision and giving money to their government. And that is a cause of hot wars, cold wars, and trade wars.
And I have a question for you, and this will be the final question before we open up to the audience. Mr. Kopsick, in a more privatized world, growing influence from private corporations may be of concern. Given the already existing issue of alleged privacy abuses and corruption from large companies, for example, Facebook, Amazon, and Google, how would your approach address these issues?
My approach would just be to revoke all the privileges and all the contracts that these companies get. I agree with Andrew Yang's idea about we should have a right to say no. We don't want we don't want our information to be collected, and we should have the right to get paid if they're profiting off our information. But I would say all these abusive and exploitative companies that exist that we complain about all the time, none of them would exist if we didn't give them charters in the first place and LLCs, limited liability corporation status, which really gives them an edge on the market and insulates them not only from market competition but from individual legal responsibility for their frauds and crimes. Sorry, I got a little bit off track there to refer to the...
Yes, just addressing your approach to addressing the privacy issues.
Yes, so the libertarian instinct is to solve people's problems by doing less, with less government, and more violently protecting already existing private property claims of companies like Amazon, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Boeing, Raytheon, which have all these contracts, monopoly privileges, protection of their land claims and intellectual property rights, patents, trademarks, everything. We need to withdraw all of these supports, and that is how we withdraw support for capitalism, the structure supporting capitalism, structure supporting the violent enforcement of capitalist property claims, so that we can have true capitalism, which is a free market where the government doesn't do anything to protect or privilege capitalism, or socialism for that matter, which we can argue over the definition of all day.
Thank you. Mr. Pulis, your response.
Yeah, the easy answer is, again, if we stopped funding Google, Facebook, and when I say we, I'm talking about the government, and I got to back up and slap my hand. We are not the government. Murray Rothbard said that if you think that the government represents you, you're wrong, because it does not. But if the government were no longer funding Google, Facebook, and the like, this would no longer be an issue because the free market would take it and competition would rise.
And if you want to stay stating next questions can come from the audience.
Yeah, I have a question. My name is Michael. What I wanted to know is, what would it look like to enforce perils in society, such as theft, murder, or even economics, capitalism, socialism? How would that be enforced based off of what you envision?
Okay. Well, again, voluntary means and also localizing. What he's talking about is, how do we provide roads? Because how many libertarians here, who will build the roads, or who will be the police, and those kinds of ideas? The answer to that question is simple. People, the people who are currently doing it would do it, except for they wouldn't be backed up by violence. You wouldn't have a police officer protected by the courts and unable to be stopped. An example, I have a friend from Michigan, his name's Brian Ellison, and in his community, 2 police officers murdered in cold blood 2 people. They haven't even done an internal investigation. They just said, they're good. Communities would take on the responsibility because we do need things like courts. We do need firemen. We do need education. We do need schools, the kinds of things that we need. In a free market, the things we need will work out themselves. People will provide it. Private businesses will arise to provide the service. Does that answer your question?
Yes. And Mr. Kopsick, the third one.
So the British kind of sovereignty over the American colonies back in the day is just the same as the American federal government's domination over the states right now. It was supposed to, I mean, at least in intent, it was supposed to be that even if the central government or the British make the law, the local authorities are the ones who get to enforce it. That's just how you do a federal system. And that's really been undermined gradually, over the last 240 years. We have all these thousands of armed federal bureaucrats, probably over 1,000. So decreasing the size of the federal workforce is really important, maybe even abolishing all. I mean, think about it. Donald Trump, public enemy number 1, half the country thinks he's a Nazi. He controls, I don't know how many, definitely more than half, somewhere between a half and all the police forces and military forces in the country as commander-in-chief. And half the country, the same people think he's a Nazi, want to surrender all their guns to him. And that just doesn't make sense. So we can find a way to have local enforcement, but the most important part of it is to diminish the amount of force involved. There's ways to apprehend people through nonviolent restraint, straitjackets. Like I said earlier, we could replace inmates in jail with have them go to mental institutions, or have them work outside or somewhere where they can't get away, somewhere away from communities. We're putting them all close to each other, and it's increasing the likelihood that they'll get diseases from each other and commit attacks on each other. And it's just not working. So we need to have an enforcement mechanism that allows peaceful, convincing rhetoric and argumentation and debate to be tried before people can be forced to radically change their lifestyles. And it's just part of libertarian, why I'm a left libertarian. Any economic system or taxation system like communism, Georgism, anything that you can be convinced to abide by or adopt or agree with of your own free will through just talking about it peacefully, that is something that can be voluntarily practiced as well, because it means I can do this over here as long as I'm not abusing anyone, and you can have a radically different view over here. As long as we're not forced to be part of the same voting bloc if we don't want to, as long as we're not forced to be in contact with each other, or have unequal exchanges or transactions, then everything should work out peacefully.
Question from
what is your philosophy solution to race relations?
So race relations, there's something that the conversation in race relations always revolves around, from what I've been able to tell. It's about whether we'll have racial separatism, like the segregationists of the South, and most modern conservatives and also neoliberals are on board with I can't think of the word of it. Trying to make people kind of all the same. We've kind of replaced multiculturalism with the idea of I'm so sorry, I can't think of this term right now. The part of our people, and basically, I don't like the idea where different races of people, immigrants from different countries, are expected to check their race or their religion or their culture or their language at the door when they come into this country. And we need to have a civic pluralist society. Multiculturalism could cause too many cultures to be, like I said, all in voting blocks together, and that could cause people with radically different cultures to be politically associated with each other when they might not want to be. And cultures who come here have the right to retain their flag, their their culture, their religion, and people shouldn't call the cops just because they're speaking a different language. Shouldn't do terrorist attacks on others because they have different religious views. So, libertarians have considered this voluntary separatism idea, and I think it would work as long as people aren't physically removed, like a lot of fans of Hans Hermann Hoppe have said, which probably doesn't mean what we think it means. I don't know. But there are ways to make sure that people can live in harmony without making sure they're in each other's faces all the time. And that's why we need to discuss civic pluralism, not just multiculturalism, and not just adopting the monolithic culture when immigrants come here.
Mr. Pulis, your response?
Sure. Again, divide and conquer. There is no difference, really, between any of these groups that they try to get us pitted against each other. Do we have different cultures? You bet. Hillbillies, they gather up and they do what they do. Urban centers, they do what they do. Does it have anything to do with color? No, it doesn't have anything to do with color. We need to start recognizing humanity as humanity. Martin Luther King said that we need to judge people on the content of their character. I do that. I don't choose my friends based on their religion. I don't choose my friends based on their ethnic heritage. I don't do that. Do I think that we should force people to not or to do? No, I don't. If a community wants to get together and have a white nationalist community, do that. I'm not going to shop in your Walmart. I'm not going to go to your community. Do you have a right to do it? Yeah. Everybody has the right to be stupid. I just don't encourage it.
Any other questions? Yeah,
Okay. When you're dealing with, your ideology, I agree with, but you're still dealing with other people who don't have the same ideology. So how do you work together then with other countries or whatever ideas like climate change and other things? How do you, if you don't have a government, if you say, well, you can do what you want and you can do what you want, well, this one wants to go and, run fires and use plastic and all the other things. You don't feel that there should be any kind of regulations or anything. You should feel it's up to the individuals to decide that they want to trash the globe that everyone uses.
Right. The answer to that, I would direct people, first of all, to Walter Block, who did a great he has a book, did a video series on libertarian environmentalism. I first would direct to him, much better at this than I am, but I did write an article on it. And what I found is that, one, if you investigate, and truly investigate what is causing many of these problems, you find the hand of government behind it. War itself, think about it. In World War II, we trotted out all of these boats and tanks and what have you, and leaked oil into the water. We sent up bullets. We destroyed and decimated. That's not even mentioning the atomic bombs that we used. So government through war has been very involved in destroying the environment. So there's that. And also, government also does things like in Russia and the Aral Sea. They had a 5-year plan. This is during the Soviet Union days. A 5-year plan to help farmers. So they imposed a restriction on the tributaries that fed into the Aral Sea for 5 years and completely decimated it because nature knows what's best. The answer to that is free markets. You might say, but how is that? And it's actually relatively simple. If you go to somebody's property and you lay trash onto their property, no one would argue that they have hurt you, right? They have brought to your property where you live and laid trash there. Why is the air and water different? The answer to that is because government regulates it. Government is in charge and have been since the late 1800s. They went away from this idea that an individual is responsible for his land, his air, his water, and they started this idea of public good. Public good. Who decides that? Who decides what is public good? The solution then is free markets, and how? Right now there are limits, and again, I could go forever, so I'm not going to make it real quick. Governments impose a limit on how much you can sue a corporation. What if there wasn't a limit? And what if everyone surrounding a factory sued?
I think that's spot on. That explains how, people, if they actually took care of their own private property, could protect against monopolies and polluters and people with large established land claims. And I think it's important that libertarians recognize that, and that is how we build our anti-pollution, pro-environment, part of our outreach to the left in our environmental policy. But in terms of, I think abolishing the federal government and the EPA, which by the way has no constitutional authority, which I think is part of why it's so easy to disregard and why it sets bad standards. That sometimes states are better than the standards that the federal government sets, and that's why sometimes we don't really need those federal standards. So I think people in their own communities, close to their nature, they're part of nature all the time, they have much more, an infinity times more incentive and need and purpose to take care of the environment that is near them than the bureaucrats in Washington do right now. And I think I'd like to see there's an idea related to students of Henry Georgia developed this idea called land value taxation. Well, he developed it, land value taxation, and now there's something called community land trusts and also community air and water trusts. I'm not sure if they exist yet. They're definitely hypothesized. But the idea is to tie the community's wealth and its economic future to the ability to preserve nature and to keep the existing wealth in land. You can sell that off, but it has to be fully compensated, and the risks of pollution and destruction have to be offset. But there have to be assurances, monetary or otherwise, legal. And yeah, we can, if we just had free markets and more private property, more widespread private property, especially among the poor, then we could more easily keep corporate monopolists and big polluters, hold them accountable for their crimes.
And we'll move in straight to your closing statement.
So like I said, I'm here to represent the Libertarian Socialists of the Libertarian Party. There is a Libertarian Socialist caucus within the Libertarian Party. There are about 40 caucuses at least right now, and about 8 or 10 of them, or 12, about a third of the caucuses are left-wing in some way. There's a pacifist and a poverty caucus. So we are here to make sure people know that there's a libertarian left, and libertarian socialism is not just an oxymoron, and that socialism means government. It doesn't. It means self-government by cooperative firms and common ownership and management of the means of production, like workplaces, factories, farms, large pieces of equipment that are difficult to move. Things that people depend on every day for their survival. Those should be owned cooperatively rather than by one person who leases and rents them out that other people are forced to borrow them to generate surplus profit for those owners. So we need to, our pitch to why property ownership is good has to involve why widespread property ownership is good. And that means more families owning the buildings that they live in so that they can't get kicked out and made homeless by a landlord overnight who decides to gamble their money away or defraud them. We need more people being independent business owners, independent contractors to deal with each other and make contracts on more voluntary, more direct ways. But we need to have a balance of personal and private ownership and also cooperative ownership in society so that we don't have to have things like central government come in and make rules for us. We can just, we can have confederations of communities. We could, like I said, dismantle the federal government and build a new one that's subservient to the people. So I'm on board completely with the message of decentralization and localism, but I have to say that I'm not just for a limited government and minimal government, because I believe that if you're trying to find the minimal amount of government, it is no government at all. And that requires self-responsibility and responsibility within our communities and enough ways of allowing workers and consumers to manage and be part owners of the places, workplaces, and pieces of capital that they're visiting every day. And also, everyone having a piece of capital on their own property couldn't hurt either. Yes.
Mr. Pulis, your closing statement.
Sure. First of all, I want to thank the Tippecanoe County Libertarian Party for hosting this event. It has been very fun. I've enjoyed it a lot. What I've learned in this debate is that my friend here, Joe, he's a voluntarist. You may not know it, and if you want, you can paint the V red, make it match what you want to do better. But he's a voluntarist. I heard over and over and over again, voluntary, 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 voluntary. Economic systems are going to be different locale to locale. It doesn't matter if you want to collectively own property in Chicago, okay, do that. I'm with it. If it works, I can adopt it. My little town, just north of Indianapolis, if I see that what you're doing works, I'll adopt it and see if it works in our town. We'll figure it out. Because through competition and the ability to see what works, we become better. You know, a lot of these ideas, and we named this the future of freedom. And I think that these kinds of ideas are the way forward for society, for evolution, for the Libertarian Party. I do. I believe in that. But I also think that it's rooted in the past. Many of the ideas that both myself and Joe talked about can be found from 1776. It can be found in the words of Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry came before the Virginia legislature and argued against the ratification of the Constitution. And he did so because he said that centralized government was going to grow. It was going to become more and more powerful. Representation was going to be squashed. I don't know if he was maybe a witch and had a little crystal ball, but I'm seeing that all around me. I'm seeing that what he talked about is coming to pass. Lysander Spooner said that he basically said that the Constitution either has enabled what the current situation in this government is 1800s, current situation in our federal government, or has been totally powerless to prevent it. The Constitution was a step backwards from the Articles of Confederation, away from freedom. We can regain that. The argument might be able to be made that at that time, and they certainly did make it, people who wanted power stole illegally the power of the states from them. Look it up. We can regain that. And how we do that is not by rising up violently with guns and pitchforks, but by peacefully showing a better way. By getting together, by talking, by figuring it out, by working together, having different ideas. The Libertarian Party isn't a monolith, but you have to sign a declaration when you join the Libertarian Party that you oppose the initiation of force. I agree with that. Because I do.
So this concludes our debate. I want to thank everybody for their participation and have a great day.
I want to congratulate Michael, the tech guy. It's a fun setup.
Yeah. All right.
Fun job.
Thanks. Gosh.
My boss.
Is that outstanding? I'm yeah, socialism. A lot of what you said up there, so it's good stuff.
Thank you. Taking the drive.